right, bro. Good morning. How's it going?
Conrad, good morning. I'm coming to you from Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and this is my first experience ever using Starlink. So thank you to Elon for helping connect us today. So
Yeah, no kidding. Honestly, it looks better or just the same as your home connection, which is probably a study in technology and how things evolve. And
yeah,
before I hit record, you were showing me the views and everything. So the video listener today is going to get a really unique experience that they haven't got before. Usually, I'm used to just the steel Vintory sign in the background and the blue office, but today it's a little bit more nature driven. So it should be
that's
fun.
right.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, we're joined by someone who probably is just as smart as Elon, maybe, if we think about kind of the context behind it. So, Clark, welcome to the show. We're happy to have you here. For the listener that maybe hasn't heard of you, we'd love a little bit of background about you before we dive into kind of the 10 lessons, the 10 mistakes that you've learned.
Brooke, Conrad, thank you for the opportunity to join you. I think you guys do a magnificent job, and it's a real treat to be able to join you today. My name's Clark. I live on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. I'm fortunate to be a servant and a steward of a lot of homeowners and a lot of guests and a lot of our wonderful team. And we are all here for great experiences. And as a firm, we've been doing this now for almost 50 years, 48 years, and we have learned a lot about what works and, as importantly, if not more importantly, what has not worked. And I know that will be our conversation today. So thank you again for the chance to join you both.
Yeah, 48 years. You got any big celebrations for the 50th? What are you going to do to celebrate?
We should do something, if for no other reason than to celebrate the journey and to celebrate the trust of our clients and the trust of our guests over the years, and not to mention our staff. We are fortunate to have a loyal staff. So we should do something, but it won't be about us. It never should be. It will be about our customers and our team members. So we will do something to hopefully acknowledge the privilege of getting to work alongside them.
That's great. So, Conrad, I know a lot of times you always start off by asking, how we met. And Clark, I don't know if you actually remember the first time we met, but it was I was working for LiveRes, and Tina Upson, our COO, and I think just cold reached out to you, and you were more than gracious and humble to have us in. You welcomed us into your office and just sat down and asked us who we were, to tell our stories, and where usually in a typical vendor, potential customer relationship, like that doesn't happen. And that had a big impact and a big impression on me. So, we've been friends ever since. And, I'm just really grateful that, you actually took that time, even as a vendor cold calling you to meet with us. So I'm really grateful. And like I said, that has definitely left an impression in me.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I felt equally as privileged to have you guys think enough of us to spend some time with us. So if you felt that way, we certainly wanted to reflect it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Clark, we've got a lot to go through, and I know you were joking a little bit before we record that you could fill a book. Or what did you say exactly about the number of mistakes you made and how long it would take to go through them all? I forget what you said exactly.
Conrad, I think the true statement is it would take something like a Jerry Lee Lewis telethon to catalog the mistakes that I made last week. And if we get into a longer thing, it would be larger than the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. But so today we'll just take a small helicopter tour through a few mistakes, but I've made quite a few and will continue to do so.
Yeah, we've got a little snippet of things, so we'll try to pack as many as we can in here and dive in with number one. So, and number one, I thought this was interesting the way you talked about. The quote was Richard Nixon once said that management was prose while leadership was poetry, and you continue to reflect the difference in the composition between the two. So, I'd love to hear kind of an example of when maybe you have to apply the management approach to what you're dealing with people or clients or customers or something like that, and when you have to apply leadership. I guess I see them as a little bit different. I'm curious how you work with them or deal with them on a recurring basis.
I would agree with you. I think they are different. And ultimately, I believe this is a comment on the acknowledgement that management and leadership are indeed two different things. And that as we think about skill composition and contributions, they are both necessary, but independently rather of each other, they are both necessary but not sufficient to achieve an outcome across market cycles. So if we have all one or all the other, we will see failure. And it's a very noble failure because both management and leadership are laudable and noble goals. My own failures have been when we have one or the other and we fail, and we tend to get into a cycle of blame or self-doubt or self-guilt. And the better reaction was, well, we didn't think enough about composition. And then I'll add on to that, both of those are uniquely human in their application. People don't always follow management. People are not always aspirational to management. Leadership is what drives people forward. So we can get a lot of great managers, and we're fortunate that we get to work alongside great managers. But leadership is what galvanizes people over a long distance. So there's an aspirational, a visionary piece that I think combines management and leadership. And we could dwell on that, I know, for hours. Suffice it to say, we are aware and cautious of the absence of one or the other relative to success and failure.
So you need that balance between the management and the leadership. And, it's kind of like I think of my mom and my dad, right? My mom did certain things really well, and my dad does certain things really well. And the balance between those is, I think what makes good children usually. So.
Yeah, and then redundancies around them. There's a moment for leadership, there's a moment for management, and then we'll talk more about the self-awareness and self-reflection to know when each of those should come to the fore.
I wonder too, Brooke, if it's not completely dissimilar to this whole visionary integrator idea we've touched on before. I don't think Clark had any EOS specific notes in the pieces that we're going to go through today, but I feel like there's a little bit of like a visionary can be very leadership driven in the sense of like, I'm going towards this big goal. I want you all to come along, like come with me, but maybe they're not always great at management where it's like, all right, now we've got to like break it down into like small individual actions and go through those pieces. What's your reaction to that? Do you think there's some similar components there? Brooke.
I do. Yeah. I mean, the visionary, right? You need that big hair. Well, you need the North Star, you need the goals, but you also need the tactical person to go in there and actually set up the framework. And I'm a big fan of frameworks that, and that could be more of that COO or that operator or integrator, whatever, framework you're using that kind of helps execute that. So I think, from Clark, the way I see it for you, it's like you have that, you're setting out there, setting the vision, setting the goals, setting that North Star. But then I'm sure you have a good amount of lieutenants out there that are doing the tactical things and kind of building out that framework for the management side.
Well, and I think on the revolutionary side, in many cases, what we've learned since the pandemic is the front line in many cases are our leaders, because they're the ones who are seeing the opportunities before the rest of us and beginning to map out ways to go do it. And ironically, the folks like me become very much the supporters of that front line. So I think there's a really interesting dynamic at work post-pandemic around frontline leadership becoming much more capable and much more certainly allocated in terms of leadership within the firm. So if I was to describe who are our leaders within the firm, it's the front line, ironically not folks like me.
That's a good point. I was actually just listening to a speaker yesterday at this mastermind retreat we were at, and he talked about that. He's like, if you want to have a really good understanding of what's going on in your business, he's like, skip the middle layer, go right to the front lines.
Yep. Our front line are very much the leaders of our firm, as they should be. And folks like me are just here to remove obstacles and support them.
Yeah. And not to make an observation, without sort of like any additional context on it, but like I've been in situations before where a leader is too hard charging, where they don't listen to the front line and they sort of go, well, I know better than you. And I know, the P&L, you don't understand what that is. So I'm not going to listen to your opinion. And I think that can lead to almost resentment amongst the team too, right? If you have a leader that's so, aggressive and direct about what they're trying to achieve, you find yourself, if you're not the leader and you're kind of one of those generals or a little bit more on the front line, not agreeing with that person and finding yourself in a tough spot. So I think that's where you can take it too far in that respect as well.
Absolutely. And so many of us learn leadership not from what works, but from what we have seen not work or not fail. And many of us have decided, I'll never be that, or I'll never do that. So we develop our own leadership profile based on things we have seen that we didn't like, as every bit as much as things that we're emulating.
Clark, I think you're a football fan. I don't know if you're a big pro football fan or mostly college football. I know we talked about that the last time we chatted together, but I feel like you see this with coaches sometimes though. Like if the last guy was like the hard nosed, like we're going to work hard every single day coach, the next coach, they tend to go reversal. So like the Patriots had like the grumpy, angry Bill Belichick, and then they hired Mayo this year, who's like, oh, it's friendly. Let's all have ice cream. And the results are not necessarily better. So I think we tend to do that sometimes too. We had, chocolate, then we want vanilla or something like that. We tend to go the opposite at times. And then usually the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, depending on the person and the style.
I think you're right. I would agree with you. That's a good analogy.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, let's kick over to number 2. So I'm going to read number 2 because I think there's some interesting pieces in here that we can layer on top of. So We're all prisoners of our lived experiences. It's been your observation that humility and curiosity are closely related cousins. So therefore, you hope that you've worked together to make sure that they grow like leaves on the tree within the company culture and beware of their absence. So humility and curiosity. I know you're very humble, Clark, which is awesome to hear, because there's people I think who we were talking about before we record who will talk about how great they are and how great their company is, and they seem to never make any mistakes, which is fascinating. You seem to have the opposite approach, which is interesting. I don't think we've talked much about curiosity, so I'd love maybe a quick note on your humbleness and how you think of that as like a value or an attribute in your business success, but also curiosity. How do you learn new things constantly, even though Twiddy and the company at large has been at this for almost 50 years, like we mentioned at the top?
Well, it's easy for me to be humble because I have a lot to be humble about. So I come by it honestly. In terms of a firm, I think one of the risks of being in business for 48 years and doing something is that we begin, even unintentionally, to think that, well, we've always done it this way. We're really good at what we do. And that can become a cage. We can be trapped in jargon that is inaccessible to our markets and our customers. And the converse of curiosity and humility are things that I think can be fatal. I'm sure we would all agree. Hubris, complacency, a lack of urgency, even a dismissiveness to customers, and an unintentional favoritism of the bureaucracy within an organization. And those things are fatal. So we have to, as a culture, make sure that we are firmly rooted. And I use that tree analogy very specifically, whether it's leaves or roots, in curiosity and humility, because that has to be how we grow and thrive and sustain ourselves and our value proposition over an extended period of time. The absence of those things can very much spell the end of our organization.
Well, I feel like you see that in business all the time. These businesses that become so popular and so powerful and so successful, they get that hubris, right? They get that arrogance of thinking that they have the greatest company out there and they don't need to work on it. And that's exactly when you got this young, scrappy kid, you know what I mean, that that goes out there and builds a company and ends up ultimately dethroning them. And I don't know the exact stats, but maybe you guys know it. But I remember reading something about, if you look at the history of like the S&P index, how long these companies would stay on and successful for generations. And then now, though, just how quickly they're turning. And you see like the list of companies that are no longer, that were, the top of the top and the best of the best. And here's a question I have for you, Clark. Like as I discussed earlier, I'm really focusing on frameworks, for businesses as we scale, and obviously you can't be in every meeting. I can't be in every meeting. We can't be involved in every, you've got hundreds and hundreds of employees, you can't be in every customer interaction. So I guess, how do you create that framework to make sure that the team is delivering on what you expect?
I wish I had a really good answer to that. And again, I'll go back to, I'm just a prisoner of my own lived experience. And I hope that my experience has a door that I can crawl out and learn new things. I listened to a podcast last week with the owner of the Washington Commanders, and he also owns the Philadelphia 76ers. Conrad, using the sports analogy, also owns a big chunk of the New Jersey Devils and a sports team in England. And he very much predicates his commitment, his accountability, as he describes it, to the city of Washington, to the city of Philadelphia. And the punchline is presence and a lot of walking around. He's never missed a home game for the Washington Commanders, never missed an away game, goes to a great majority of games because he believes he's accountable, not just to the organization, but the city, their fans, their players. He never leaves early. My framework there, and I wish this were better, it's the old walking around. And the hard part that we all struggle with is we want to communicate and therefore we want to talk. Our framework is listen first. And I'll use that Stephen Covey quote: in order to be understood, first seek to understand. And that, whether that's a frontline component, whether that's a client experience or a guest experience, if we don't understand their perspective, we will never in turn be understood in our own. So I think our framework there is one of presence and listening. And I know we'll talk about that again in this segment.
Love that.
I think the curiosity element there comes to mind too, Clark, where it's like, I've been in situations where it's like the best thing for me to do is to not say anything and to not talk. And there's a lot of people who struggle with that. They feel like they always have to interject their opinion or always have to have some comment, particularly when they maybe are in like a management or a leadership position, going back to the previous, kind of thread that we had a moment ago. So I think that's also a valuable skill, is listening. And some people don't kind of develop that muscle, or they don't realize that, like we just said, a little bit, that we can learn a lot from those people, kind of in different positions at different companies and stuff like that. What do you set aside like certain times of your day to go through and like read new material or go through and listen to this kind of stuff? Or how do you approach that curiosity angle? Is it just stuff you fit in between the cracks, so to speak? What's your approach there?
Just as my own preference, I am very much a calendar guy. I love looking at a calendar and thinking about it. As I've gotten a little bit older, I recognize now that it's more of a rhythm than a calendar. So I'll do a little bit of focus, I'll do a little bit of laptop work, but then I'll very much balance that by very simply walking around. And I'll even try to spend more time walking around than I will in a meeting, for example, or in front of a laptop, for example. At the end of the day, the more time I'm spending in front of customers and our own staff and helping to listen and learn and coach and share perspective, challenge some thinking, those are probably the moments in which I'm most productive over the long term, because now I'm multiplying rather than adding or subtracting.
Awesome. All right, then let's go over to number 3 then. So the quote is, "It's a privilege to earn the responsibility in the service of our customers and staff. We strive to never forget our duty to them in our efforts and choice in accepting it." So you use a lot of words, Clark, that I feel like most people in our industry don't use. This idea of like privilege, stewardship, earnest responsibility. These are words where a lot of people are like, it's a homeowner, it's a client, I try to earn them a lot of revenue. Like, I think some of the words you use are very different, where it's like, it almost feels personal in a way. I mean, it's business, but it feels personal to you. How do you kind of develop this mindset over the years that you describe in this particular point?
I think part of it is just what we've picked up along the way. And the other side of that, the mistake, is to complain about so many things. And my dad would always have a joke. He would smile and say, well, if we didn't have any homeowners and guests, we sure wouldn't have any problems, would we? Which was his way of saying, hey, wait a second. This is our value proposition. So many times we can complain about customers or homeowners or different things. And next thing you know, you walk into these gatherings and everyone is venting and complaining. But the reality is, if we stand in front of our homeowners or our guests, this is our choice. We make a decision every day at 9:00 whether to accept what are profound responsibilities. And rather than complain about that, I hope that culturally, we can certainly vent, we can certainly share our frustrations. That's healthy. It's equally as healthy, if not more so, to acknowledge the wonderful opportunities we have as a function of those responsibilities and our choice in accepting it. So our most valuable resource walks out the front door every day at 5:00, and they choose to return at 9 a.m. Nobody's forcing anyone to come to work. When you show up at work, you're acknowledging the choice of that responsibility, and we should embrace and honor that. And I hope that's a component of our cultural commitment to client success and the guest experience.
Awesome. I think the next one could perhaps be a little bit of a quicker one. I just think it's a great quote, honestly, Clark. So number 4 in the book was, "The extra mile, as your dad would say, is seldom crowded." Yeah. So maybe we could talk maybe a little bit about the idea behind that quote, just this idea of like going above and beyond. How do you internalize that, or how do you, make that part of the culture at Twiddy?
We think a lot about that in terms of, I have this triangle, Brooke, a framework. I have this triangle in my mind, 3 sides, obviously: markets, margins, and differentiation. And it's hard to be remarkable or be in the extra mile everywhere, but we are very thoughtful, I hope, in where we are actively working to go the extra mile. And when we're doing that, it's incumbent upon us to understand the competitive marketplace. And is that particular extra mile not crowded? Can we have a big moat in that extra mile competitively? And are we building a durable competitive advantage in that chosen extra mile? Dad would always say that as a function of hard work. He would just say, if you work hard and you are cognizant in going the extra mile, everything else will take care of itself.
Yeah. I think David Angotti did a keynote presentation at some conference one time, and it was really good. And it was something to the effect of, the difference between ordinary and extraordinary is just going that extra, couple percentage points. It's just, what's that extra thing? Like, doing this standard is easy. Everyone's doing it. It's table stakes. but who is going above and beyond consistently and building out that system where, the culture of the team is continuing to do that. And it's so true. I mean, you see it all the time with, I mean, look at like Four Seasons and Ritz-Carlton, the extra that they go. And there's a reason why people will pay a significant premium when, you turn off the lights, it all looks the same.
Yeah. In North Carolina, obviously basketball is our religion. So in my frustration with Duke University basketball over the years, my observation has been Duke does a better job than anybody in the country playing for 40 minutes. There are a lot of great teams that will play for 35 minutes extraordinarily well, 38, 39, even 39 and a half. Duke plays great for 40 minutes, and that to me is the reason for their success over time, more so than any other thing.
It sounds like a simple insight, Clark, too. But I guess part of the reason I was thinking about this quote, and maybe in the context of inventory and the the kind of premise of the work that I've done with Brooke over the years, is that when you do table stakes, it's actually really hard to win over homeowners. Like if a homeowner is working with a particular property management company and they're just doing the bare minimum, it's like you need to do something a lot better in order to kind of hit them off their spot. If they're happy with where they're at, you can't just be a little bit better, or they're like, I'm not going to switch from company ABC to company XYZ. If it's just a little bit better, it has to be a lot better. Is there anything that you've kind of taken of, maybe it's homeowner related marketing, or maybe it's guest related marketing, that is
I think
kind of
you're
on that
exactly
idea?
right.
Yeah.
I think in terms of if we're thoughtful about how we create value, if we acknowledge that we're average or table stakes, that invites a reversion to the mean. And if we think about margins, where are we thoughtfully achieving greater margins on behalf of homeowners and guests? And that's really difficult to do. So it's easy to say the extra mile is seldom crowded. Human nature doesn't want to do that because it's really hard to do it over a period of time. And then you get into lots of thinking about talent, skill composition, those kinds of things. So it's a fascinating story, but we have to be very thoughtful around value creation in terms of not only how we retain homeowners. Brooke, your great quote there is, if you want to grow, first fix your leaky bucket. So retention and then growth. And we have to be very thoughtful about that value proposition.
Yeah. Yeah, it amazes me. So many people, so many of these companies are doing it just like everybody else, and there's no core differentiators. And it becomes, when that happens, it becomes a commodity. And what happens with commodities? It becomes a race to the bottom, and it's all about price.
Exactly.
And it drives down that price. So you have to differentiate. I remember, and I've probably told this story before, but when I launched Vantage, here's a guy that doesn't even live in the area, that's driving 3 hours every week to start this company. He has 0 properties. And I literally set up shop right next to Caldwell Banker, who had 4,000 properties under management. How am I supposed to differentiate? And I remember I hired this GM, and she was very good because she knew the industry. And thank goodness for her. If I didn't have her, we would have never, I would have stumbled my way through this. But, she kept on going back to Brooke, that's not the way it's done here. That's not the way we do it. And I'm like, that's exactly what I'm going for. If I build a rental program like everybody else, it becomes a race to the bottom, and I'm not going to do that. So we innovated. We did. Sometimes I look back on how silly they were, but we bought an insurance policy on every single reservation, where if it rained 4 or more days out of their week's vacation, we actually gave them a full refund. Now that was not that expensive, and I did it originally to get more guests. But what ended up happening is the owners liked that. They thought, hey, that's innovative, that's unique. And then we partnered with a travel vacation club, and we gave every one of our owners access to this travel vacation club to have them travel all over the world for a couple $100 a week. And then we did, if the property didn't have a gym, we partnered with a local gym. I paid this high school kid, this college kid on his bike to literally deliver USA Today's on everyone's doorstep every morning. And I knew if I didn't differentiate, if I didn't do something different, there's no way I was going to gain any market share, And so I had to, and like I said, what they thought was, again, it was originally meant to be for a guest acquisition strategy, but ultimately it ended up becoming an owner acquisition strategy because they thought I was going to bring in a different clientele, a better experience for their guests.
I think you're exactly right, Brooke. I've read about your journey, and that's an amazing component of that. And let's be honest, our homeowners, our clients are whip smart. They can see through and judge markets in fractions of a second. So it's that old joke, get the facts before they get you. Your clients will see through that. And they have. We've made a lot of mistakes in terms of saying one thing to clients and they see something different. So we're very thoughtful about that. But a lot of credit goes to our homeowners. They know what value is and what they're willing to pay for almost instinctively.
Spot on.
Yeah. Well, my frame on this as Clark has always been most unsuccessful people don't own second homes. Most unsuccessful people don't own nice second homes, right? So there's almost a certain level of, standards that person has set in their own life. I mean, they've been financially successful, obviously, in many cases, to be able to buy $1 million home in the Outer Banks. So that person is probably has a very successful career, perhaps has is an entrepreneur, owns a business, or is involved in a business at a high level. So the idea that you're going to use very simplistic, ideas or frameworks to sort of win them over on the homeowner side, to your point from a minute ago, Brooke, just isn't going to be the case. You actually have to deliver. You can't say you're going to deliver. You've got to actually deliver, which is sort of a different side of it. Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. Well, let's go to number 5 then. So I think we've touched on this already. We've touched, you said the 2 most important words in your business, Clark, are trust and listen. I feel like we've kind of touched on listen here and there. I don't know if we've exactly gone down trust too far. So maybe expand on kind of some of those concepts a little bit. What are some applications of trust you have in the business? Again, both guest and homeowner. And then what are some examples of listening? Maybe if we didn't touch on them previously throughout the last few points.
My observation there has been that, Brooke, and I've heard you and Conrad talk about this, there are so many things in our industry that are compelling and important, whether it's technology or tech stacks. Brooke, I know you're writing a book about that, so many other aspects. And yet at the same time, we know that real estate is ultimately a platform for human interaction. So much of what we do is designed to present a human and high touch, high-tech component to what the client experience is, which is to say, there's a great quote out there that said, people don't choose what to trust. They first choose who to trust, and then they choose what to believe. So we think a lot about the behaviors around trust building to clients, and it's from that trust that we can then construct the trust in what to believe in terms of a successful journey. So everything, I hope that what we do is built on trust. And the reason I combine trust and listening is really thoughtful listening is probably the best single way to build trust. So one builds the other. But without trust, we are an absolute commodity.
That's right. That's great. I remember that. That reminds me of a quote. It's people buy from people. People buy from people they like, and people buy from people they like and trust. And that's true. If you don't trust them, it doesn't matter how good it sounds. It's not worth it.
Your favorite restaurant, Conrad, your favorite restaurant, Brooke, I'd be willing to guess is your favorite restaurant because of the way they treat you when you come in and the confidence that your experience will be as good as the one before that. So my guess would be your favorite restaurant is the one you trust the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And of course the food has to be good. Well, it's always an interesting, and I'm sure, Clark, I don't know if there's is there any Chick-fil-A's actually in the Outer Banks? This is very off script, but I'm curious.
No, that's a great question. We get that all the time. The closest Chick-fil-A's are about an hour away, much to our regret.
Yeah, but it always blows my mind when I interact at a Chick-fil-A of how they get the young person working their first job to care, and that has to be a leadership culture down top thing, because I know the training documentation. The first job I had was at a grocery store, Clark, and we read the training, or we went through the little video programs about what you're supposed to do. Like one of our rules, for example, was if a customer in the store comes within, I think it was like 8 or 10 feet of you, hi, hello, how are you doing? That sort of thing. But then the management of the store never did it. So it was quickly ignored. If someone came up to me and asked me, I would help them. But I fell into that as a 17, 18-year-old kid of, well, the manager doesn't follow that rule of welcoming someone within 10 feet. So if they ask me for help, I'll help them, but I'm not going to go out of my way to say anything to them. So I don't know if it ties exactly into this idea. Maybe there's other pieces it ties into, but this idea of how do you get the young person to be motivated to do what you want them to do? And it starts top down. If they see someone above them doing it, they're just going to mimic them and be like, well, this person's doing it, I should say your pleasure, because they taught me to do that, and they're doing it as well. So
I think if I was in the service for 10 years, and if I had one lesson learned from the service, there's actually 2. It's number 1 is the most important rule to me of leadership ever: lead by example, and concurrent to that, serve others first. And people are watching, and they will see leadership by example. They will respond to that. They will also respond to serve others first. Both of those are heavily based around trust and listening.
Yeah, yeah. I have a client. I don't know if this ever happened in your situation, Brooke. I had a client last year who, long story short, every cleaner's sick. Every cleaner can't make it. He goes, okay, what's the property? Gets in his car, drives over, meets one of his assistant GMs, and cleans the property himself.
There
This
you
is
go.
someone with 200 plus properties. Certainly,
Yep.
could have tried to call around. He did. It just didn't work. And he said, all right, well, Gus is going to be there in 2 hours. I'm closest. Let me go ahead and do it. And I'm sure that won
That's
him a lot of brownie points and some jokes, back at the
absolutely.
office about, that sort of thing.
And
So,
that'll be folklore for years to come. And it just
yeah.
shows kind of what's the core of the person, that it's, that's a great leader right there.
Yeah, he really is. Yeah. Awesome. So number 6, I think we kind of might've touched on this previously, but perhaps we can expand upon it a little bit more, Clark. Being able to translate business language across sectors. So sometimes the curse of expertise is that it does confine us to jargon. So on occasion we're using, very complicated terminology and some of these things that can confuse people in our organization or people that we're dealing with. So the Stephen Covey quote that you mentioned a few minutes ago that maybe we could expand a little bit more is seeking to understand before we're understood, and making our business relatable to others in how they understand language and those sorts of things. So what are some examples, I guess, Clark, of how you work through that communication? Maybe you have a somewhat of a complex idea, but how do you then break it down and explain it to a homeowner or to a guest in a very simple, straightforward way they can understand?
My experience and a lot of my failures over time has been in an effort to be very precise in our thinking and reflect the expertise that we think creates value. So many of our folks have honed their craft over extended periods of time. But the curse of expertise is it's a prison in terms of understanding. So we would, as we engage with homeowners, create these elaborate presentations that were absolutely rich in acronyms and advanced data points. And what we found was our expertise was entirely inaccessible to the market, and that we were in fact enabling virtually no understanding, and we were not building smarter and more capable resource allocators in the form of homeowners. We were actually perhaps doing the opposite of that. So my thought there has been, it's not a homeowner's job to understand the terminology of this business. We're bridge builders. It's our responsibility to build a bridge to them. So if they're in the medical community, the legal community, the defense industrial community here on the Outer Banks, any of those communities, we should be able to translate the performance of their asset into language that they are more familiar with and more accessible to them in their experience. And that has been an enormous barrier. The good news, conversely, is when we're able to build that bridge and make it more accessible to them, their journey becomes more fun, more rewarding. They're more responsive. They're more capable. They trust us. We can in turn move on their behalf more rapidly and at a lower cost. But so many times our best intentioned communication were in effect gibberish because they were entirely unintelligible to someone who hadn't worked in the industry for 20 years.
Can you give an example of that? Like how you would translate, all of our crazy acronyms and words and information on a property to somebody in a different industry, like how you do that?
We go and talk about, well, what percentage of your weeks this year are advanced bookings, and what's the price of your home? It's 10 times annual rents. And oh, by the way, you can reinvest using these 3 different channels, and we can measure performance, incremental return, incremental revenue relative to couches. And to someone in their scrubs getting off the train in Philly, going in to be an orthopedic surgeon, that was entirely gibberish. What we should have talked about was, hey, this is an asset. You're going to generate revenue. You're going to have costs. We can categorize your costs. We can talk about risk and return being inseparable. Tell me more about your vision. Much more simple language than APHs and work orders. Like, I know it drives you gentlemen crazy when someone calls in and we say, well, we're going to put in a work order. None of our guests have any idea what that means, nor do they care. None of our homeowners have any idea what that means, and nor do they care. And yet it's the language we use. So to me, that's a barrier. A work order is not an outcome. And what they care about is the outcome. And my analogy there is all the barcodes on your Amazon package. Do you care what any of them do? And as long as you get what you ordered in the time frame you ordered it. So that's just my example of that. It's always, as you can tell, I'm passionate about that. Make it accessible. And I'll add in 20 seconds or less, So many homeowners have other investments. They might have equities or bonds or other things. This asset to them is probably a hedge to a larger portfolio. Let's compare those performances rather than just say absolutely in a vacuum, here's the performance of your home. Oh, well, it returned 5%. Well, if the equity markets are 7%, why would you own a vacation home? Well, that's a great question over time. We have to be able to understand that. So it goes back to understanding before we're understood, but it's a huge barrier to understanding. And I'll leave it at that. I know we can't go on forever.
Yeah. No, my only quick follow up there, Clark, and maybe this is a crazy idea. I don't know if you've thought of this, is do you ever organize the people in your team responsible for the homeowner? I don't know exactly what that role is called in your company, on similarities between those people. So for example, if I work for you and I manage, 55 of your properties and I have those 55 homeowners I'm dealing with, are my 55 homeowners have similar characteristics, or is it just kind of assigned by geolocation or something like that? I was just curious about that side of it.
It's a combination of both. We certainly want to bring expertise, but we also recognize that there are inevitable personality similarities and a gravitational component. We do a lot of in-person homeowner receptions, and we're able to spot what I'll call gravitation there and building relationships there. And once we see that relationship begin to flower, then we're able to support that. But we certainly want homeowners to have options, whether it's ages and stages, whether it's commonalities. You're from Philly, I'm from Philly. Any of those things, we want to embrace that. That's the human aspect of a homeownership experience that we think is incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Again, I probably feel like we could do a whole hour of follow-ups there, but we'll be respectful of the time.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
We can do a whole session on that one.
We've even thought about asking homeowners to do some personality measures, things like that, so that we can diagnose or understand better a profile. We haven't gotten that far yet, but most of our team thinks that would be a really fun conversation to have.
Yeah. I obviously have a much smaller business, Clark, but I've started, as my client success team has expanded, I've started to spot that, hey, I think you actually would be a better fit with this person. And I sort of assign, not just based off some round robin or, sort of ranks system, but rather just like, I talked to this client quite a bit before they signed. I think person ABC would be a good fit. And I've started to do that. And I think it's led to some positive outcomes for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Number 7, a trusted banker once gave you 2 golden pieces of advice that have guided you along the way. He said, first, that through hard work, we could have anything, but not everything. And that second, we would never be able to buy a reputation. I love that second one. That's a great one. So maybe expanding on those 2 ideas of reputation building. And we talked about trust earlier. I feel like those are obviously close cousins in some respect. And then what do you mean by we can have anything, but not everything? Maybe we could expand on both those ideas.
This is a lot about how we spend money. And he would oftentimes, this is Taylor Sugg at Town Bank, who we are fortunate to have had a relationship with now for more than 30 years. And he would think a lot about how we were spending money. And if we tried to do everything, well, we wanted offices and vehicles and tech stacks and this and that, it rapidly would outpunt our coverage, for lack of a better phrase. And can we finance that? And what can we take out loans for? And I think that was his really simple way of saying, specialize. Don't try to be everything. You're fortunate that you can afford any one thing, but don't try to afford everything. It won't end well. And I've never forgotten that. If nothing else, it goes back to that self-awareness and self-reflection. And what he would say is, I'll give you a loan on the thing you do really well. And then the other component of it is I can distinctly remember on several occasions him sitting across a desk and saying, I'll never be able to finance a reputation for you. So be very, very careful. And I can't help you there, but move very slowly on a reputation, particularly in a small town, because you've probably heard me say it, if you're not who you say you are, you'll be found out very quickly.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me of a quote from Warren Buffett, and I love this. And it's we can afford to lose money, even a lot of money. We cannot afford to lose a reputation, even a shred of reputation. Let's be sure that everything that we do in business can be put on the front page of a national newspaper by an unfriendly but fair reporter. It took us 37 years to get here, but it can take us 37 minutes to lose it.
Yeah,
I love that.
I've always loved that quote. The same ladder analogy. It take you a long time. It take you 100 steps to get to the top of the ladder and only 1 to get to the bottom. So we think a lot about that. And that's always been great advice. If nothing else, hey, what are the financial levers you can pull, but also the off-balance sheet intangibles are no less important at a human level.
Yeah. I think the version of that I heard, Brooke, was write every email that gets going to be read in a deposition one day or something like that. So
Yes.
whenever I've had to send an email that wasn't going to be the kindest or the friendliest, I'm like, how exactly would I phrase this? Or how exactly should I phrase this to make sure if I was reading this later on, I would be, even if I have to say something negative, I'm proud of what I said or I stand by what I say, that sort of thing, because it's easy to fire something off. Yeah.
I worked for a guy one time who every morning said professionals embrace scrutiny. And he would go out and say, everything we do should embrace and invite and welcome scrutiny. So let's go out and find some scrutiny and compete. And I often thought that was a good way of talking about that reputation. But I do think professionals embrace scrutiny, whether it's sports and a scoreboard, a batting average, or the vacation rental industry and our ability to participate in a wide range of activities. And professionals embrace scrutiny.
Yeah. Right on. Number 8, very simply, success comes through our ability to create value for others through the quality of our service to them. Therefore, there's happily a nobility in that service. Again, Clark, feel like we have touched on this a little bit. But is there any other extra details to add in with this idea of that we kind of get what we earn maybe in a way in this life and the work that we do over a long term?
My observation, and we've all heard it, no one sits in high school and says, I want to work in the vacation rental business or the laundry business. And over time, I have begun to think differently about that. Sometimes it's almost like a self-minimizing thought, well, we're in the service industry. And I think actually the opposite is true. There is a nobility in making a commitment to improve the lives of others. I heard someone say once that nobility is either saving lives or making lives better. And I do think there's a nobility in hopefully what we're able to do. We should change people's lives for the better in every interaction. So I think that's very important for us to understand and hopefully recognize, perhaps at a more business level, the transactional nature of what we do or the aspirational nature of what we do. I hope we're always putting in context the transaction within a much broader aspiration. Yeah, we might be putting in a work order, but what we're trying to do is help you make progress in your life. Yeah, we might be trying to book your weeks, and that's very important. We hope that we're creating a journey that you'll share with your family and never forget. So I think there's very much that transactional, aspirational, that's related to leadership, poetry, management, prose, all of these things I hope are flowing together.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we talk about this all the time. It's like, this is, very often this is people's only vacation they get a year. You know what I mean? And you have a responsibility for that. And it could be, I'm sure you have many stories, Clark, of this was grandma's last vacation, or, someone who's going through cancer or some other disease, and they know very well this may be their last vacation. So there is a certain amount of responsibility, for that.
And at the front line, we also often reinforce that point. Hey, what you do matters. You as a human and what you're doing for other people matters. And there is nobility in that. There's human dignity in that, and that is valued. And that's, to me, remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I like that. Number 9, going back kind of into the quote bucket I like on this one. John Wooden once said to try to make every day a masterpiece. That's obviously tough to do in reality, but perhaps through some self-awareness and self-reflection, we're able to approach it. So therefore, when we lose those things, happiness in our efforts comes elusive. So how do we make every day a masterpiece, or at least get as close as we can, Clark, to making more days masterpieces?
My mistake, this is a segment about mistakes. My mistakes have been so often, if I were to go home and be unhappy, burned out, angry, resentful, frustrated, a sense of failure, all of those things, the antidote for all of that was self-awareness and self-reflection. And if I didn't make those two things a discipline, I found, again, prisoner of my lived experience, there was nothing I could do that would make me happy. And that was a risk and a danger, because that path doesn't lead anywhere promising or fulfilling. So my observation has been it's the discipline of self-awareness and self-reflection that is the pathway to happiness and fulfillment in our efforts. And at the end of the day, if we're to do this for a long period of time, there has to be a lot of that. And so that was a very real mistake I had made. And the antidote, I hope the aspirational, the learning side of that was make that reflection and awareness an enormous part of what we're doing. So I'm not one to talk about my own mistakes very much because it will bore your readers, but I think a lot about the firm. But as a cultural component, particularly among our leadership team, self-awareness and self-reflection is the path to happiness.
Well, when I was prepping for this and I read this, it immediately reminded me of a podcast I listened to with Jim Collins. I know, Clark, you read all his works, and he had a line in he's talking about good to great, and he said he meticulously tracks his time management and his personal productivity, but most importantly, the component of how the fulfillment connects with that. So he actually has 3 stopwatches where he is literally tracking his daily activities, and then he logs them into a spreadsheet. And he's done this for thousands of days, years and years and years. And he also then goes into this and goes into the spreadsheet, and he tracks it. And he ends the day. He goes, did I have a plus day or a minus day?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then what he's found is he can find a direct correlation to his fulfillment based on, was he focused on research? And that's the good day. But he's done this almost like a scientific method to figure out that's the thing. So that's his goals now. His goals are, if I'm spending X percentage of my time in research mode, I am going to be satisfied and fulfilled. And, many people came to him, to start these institutes and, with tons of opportunity to earn money. He's like, I don't want to do that. I just want to be fulfilled. But he actually had to figure out what that actually was that was fulfilling him. And it came down to just research.
Yeah. And a very disciplined way, a very structured way of reflection and awareness. And I certainly can't approach that level of sophistication, but it's been my observation that without that discipline, there's nothing that will make us happy. More homes, more guests, better staff, all of those things can be elusive in terms of happiness unless there is some inward reflection.
Yep.
I like that.
Maybe that was my personal lesson, my personal mistake on this list is very much in that regard.
Number 10, this business, as with so many others, remains very simply, all about people. It contains a lot of other things, but it's wrapped up all in good people. Again, Clark, I feel like we've touched on this a little bit so far today, but is there anything else to add into kind of your recruitment of people? I know we talked about this in our last conversation, your training of people, your development of people. How do you find great people and let them work for an opportunity, serve for Twiddy and Company?
I used to work for a guy one time, and he told me something I'll never forget. He said, remember, it's not just about the people. It's all about the people. And I've never forgotten that. And at the end of the day, I know we experience this in our own lives. We interact across a wide range of different things and platforms and technologies and operating structures and all of these things. My observation had been that at the end of the day, it's still all about people, whether they feel heard and valued and respected. Are their voices listened to? All of those very basic human emotions that I think are very real to the material success and endurance of our businesses over time. So when in doubt, I hope our company and the service we provide to our clients and our customers is very much predicated on a recognition that our sharp professionals who've honed their craft, who go home at 5 o'clock and choose to come back in the morning. So the other cautionary note is avoid the temptation to make this business something it's not. I have on occasion done some wild goose chasing, and I am reminded through my failures, and I'm just fortunate that I have too many smart people around me to let me fail totally. Most of my failures have been wild goose chasing that have without the accompanying recognition that in the end, it's all about the people.
Mm-hmm. So Clark, I've probably quoted this your quote here about 20 times. It feel like Conrad, this comes up every single time. It's just because it's so good. It's so spot on, and I couldn't agree more. And ultimately, it really is about the people who drive the success of any business. I mean, you can have the best strategy, the most innovative product, or cutting edge technology, but without the right people, it's not going to come together. And I couldn't agree more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that can be cautionary. That there's an aspirational element to that. When it's right, it is right. It's a beautiful thing to behold, and then correspondingly, when it's wrong, it's really wrong. It's painful. It's hurtful. It's the path of anger, not almost like a Star Wars analogy. It's the path to anger and fear and those kinds of things. So, of all the things I think we spend time on, the recognition that it's all about the people is probably the most important relative to our clients and the experience we create for them.
That was a great one to end on.
Yeah, I think a lot of venture capital money, Clark, has gone up in smoke because there's a lot of people that think this is not about people and it's all about other things, and a lot of positive or negative outcomes have come from that. Well, Brooke, anything else we got, Clark? I think for just 2 more minutes here, anything else we can perhaps slide in at the end out of off script? One more question for him before we let him
Yeah. So Clark, obviously, this is an honor to have you on. I've been a big fan of yours for a long time. It's just like, go back to the sports analogy, when we had this one on the calendar, I circled this well in advance and was really excited about this one. So, but yeah, if you could go back into time, go back to your 25-year-old self and give a piece of advice, what would it be?
Thank you, gentlemen, for having me on here today. It's a pleasure for me to learn from you both. You do such wonderful things for our industry, and I'm fortunate to even be in the same room. My 25-year-old self, I'd say, hey, stop being an idiot. More importantly, I would say, hey, keep the faith. And the faith is obviously there's a lot to that. Maybe in a business language, it's the Stockdale paradox. Don't doubt the outcome, but confront the facts as they are in the moment. Second would be serve others first. I think that's where happiness ultimately comes from. And the third would be don't ever forget. It's all about the people and the relationships you create. So that's, if I was riding next to him or saw him in the parking lot, that's what I'd pull him aside and say.
Well, the people listening, Clark, need to do one thing for us. So they got an awesome episode here. Again, thank you, Clark. They need to leave us a review, though. So go to your podcast app of choice. iTunes, Spotify is where we get the most downloads. Therefore, we appreciate those the most. But anywhere we'll take, we're not too picky. Leave us a review so we can convince awesome guests like Clark to come on. We appreciate your time as well today, Clark. And we'll catch everybody on the next show. Thanks so much.